Speranza is the director of the Transatlantic Defence and Security Programme at the Centre for European Analysis. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. I want to ask you, first of all, about this attack that has apparently happened in Mariupol, which appears to have hit a maternity hospital. That might suggest that the Russian troops are using some form of indiscriminate shelling. What do you react to that? Are you surprised that they would not be attempting to use more targeted attacks?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm not surprised by what we're seeing on the ground in Mariupol and elsewhere. I mean, this is reflective of Russia's traditional way of war that we saw, elsewhere in Aleppo, in Grozny, in other places in Georgia, where, Russia's strategy is essentially to do as much damage as quickly as possible to kind of facilitate their occupation. And this makes it easier for them to move into these cities and population centers after they have done this tremendous kind of shelling, which is what we're starting to see on the ground. And I think, it does look like they are using indiscriminate types of attacks. And to be honest, as tragic as it is, I think it's easier for the Russians to occupy when there is less Ukrainian resistance. So it's not really in their interests to try and have these meticulously targeted attacks, because the ultimate goal is to kind of storm as much territory as they possibly can and escalate as quickly as they can, because clearly on the ground, the Russians are still having some drawbacks and some trouble with logistics, with sustainment. They're not making progress as quickly as they hoped they would. And now Russia's starting to be cut off from the world. The sanctions are starting to squeeze and to have an impact. So I think it's in Putin's interest to get this done as quickly as possible.
Obviously, the subject of no-fly zones and air defense is an absolute key one to all of this. We've heard before that NATO, and the US and others are saying that they are not going to put NATO weaponry, NATO air weaponry into the skies above Ukraine. Interestingly, there is a line coming out from Reuters now saying the White House says defense leaders are in touch with Ukraine and NATO over fighter jets. This is obviously in relation to Poland's offer to put fighter jets into Germany at the disposal of Ukraine. Talk us through, if you can, because this is getting complicated to me. Talk us through, if you can, how it would be possible to get fighter jets to protect Ukrainian airspace without endangering NATO troops or escalating the situation.
Well, I think you're asking the key question, and the answer is there's no clear path for how to make this happen without the risk of escalation. I think the major concern that we are hearing is that if we were to have these fighter jets flying, the only way to get them into Ukraine is to fly them, and you have to fly them from bases nearby. And so if they're coming from, as the polls suggested, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, that's a NATO base and a US base. And so in theory, even if they're flown by Ukrainian pilots, coming from that as their base means that there's a risk that NATO and the alliance could be considered a co-combatant to the conflict, to the war. And that, of course, has much wider implications for not just the US, but also for all of the members of the NATO alliance. And it's really tough because I think we're seeing the West trying to walk this tricky line of wanting to fight and wanting to do the right thing to support Ukraine because it's in our interest to do so, but not wanting to risk escalation. And this is a dilemma that we've seen time and again throughout history, but it's a really defining moment for the alliance. And I think what we saw from the polls was an attempt at trying to find a creative solution and a way to maybe do this deniably to get the jets in there without necessarily betraying who and how got them there. But unfortunately, the execution did not go, I think, the way we would have hoped. And so now we're stuck where all of this is being talked about in the headlines. And now I'm not sure how we would go about making this happen on the ground without risk of escalation.
Really appreciate you giving us your thoughts on this. Speranza, thank you very much indeed for your time, ma'am.
Thanks for having me.